Well, for some analysis on FOCAC, we're now joined live from Johannesburg by Kosu from African Risk Capacity. Kosu, thank you so much for joining us here on Africa Live. To begin with, please give us your assessment of the just concluded forum on China-Africa cooperation.
Okay, thank you. I think the forum was actually a very successful one. You saw high-level participation from the government of China, as well as the participation of several heads of states from African countries. It was successful because we saw the announcement from President Xi Jinping of US $60 billion committed over a course of 3 years to 10 areas of focus of cooperation between African governments and China. And obviously, these 10 areas saw an expansion from the traditional investments in infrastructure to also looking at investments within the agricultural sector, public health, peace and security, which is an expansion of the role that China plays within the African context. So I think for the African governments, for China, and obviously for the government of South Africa, it was quite a successful event.
Now, how best do you think the African continent can position itself to fully benefit from what you call massive development support that we saw being extended by China?
I think it is very important now that we begin as African governments to craft and prioritize what are the focus areas within the 10 areas that were identified for mutual cooperation. I think the particular emphasis needs to be paid to the agricultural sector because we have the majority of Africans being employed within this sector. So questions now have to be raised about the modality through which financing will be delivered to assist those who are engaged within the sector to say, can we improve the resilience of Africans? Can we increase the investments going into the sector to improve the performance of the sector? Obviously, that is coupled with other investments in infrastructure, etc. But I think it's a very important time for Africa in terms of how we define how these resources are used to deliver ultimately to African people the development agenda that we have set out, which is quite ambitious, but ultimately is something that we are mandated to do.
Now, of course, China is just one of many others that are showing
I also think that it's important.
It's just saying that China is one of many that is showing a keen interest, of course, in the African continent. But of course, what are some of the key risk factors now that African countries need to be aware of in their engagement with international development partners?
I think it is important, and this is a relationship or risks that we should be aware of, not only in terms of the interaction with the Chinese government, but just development partners in general, is that we prioritize African institutions that are able to deliver to the needs of the African continent. We have seen quite a number of innovation or dramatic innovation on the African continent in terms of responses to the issues that we face. And I think that in crafting how these resources are used, we need to look at how do we upscale our African institutions in order to deliver on the needs. So for example, you have the development of institutions such as the African Risk Capacity, which was established by the African Union to help African governments better plan, prepare and respond to natural disasters. And this has proven to be quite effective. So the challenge, I think, within this context of South-South collaboration and the enhanced resources that we're seeing coming from Africa is how do we upscale these instruments and these mechanisms, and how do we also ensure that African people are also able to engage with China and other markets to also share what Africa has to bring to the rest of the world. So I think that it's quite an important time in terms of the relationship between Africa and China, but also how Africa is able to leverage that in its interaction with wider development partners.
Well, thank you so much for that analysis. Kosu speaking to us there from Johannesburg. She is from African Risk Capacity.